One of the plaintiffs in this case talks about MAID being a monkey on their back. It's this thing that's hanging over them in every decision they make. Every day they have to wake up and decide, should I live or am I a burden on everybody? And should I let the government end my life?
Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
In this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona Mackenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women. So assisted dying for people with a terminal diagnosis might become law here in the UK this year, so in 2025, and potentially reality 2 years after that. Our MPs can still say no to this, but there is a chance also to amend the current Westminster law to prevent the worst outcomes for the vulnerable. We really want to learn from what's happened in Canada, and so we're speaking today to three brilliant feminist legal academics who work in this area, Professors Janine Benedet, Isabel Grant, and Professor Emerita Elizabeth Sheehy. I am so thrilled to talk to you all, and you're obviously valiant feminist campaigners. I know some of you from previous campaigning work I've done.
We're so excited to speak with you, and as Fiona mentioned, this is not yet law in the UK, and there's a strong public discussion happening about it, and one of the things we hear all the time is it's not going to be like Canada. Canada is irrelevant.
We were told the same thing. I'll just say that. We were told, Canada's not Belgium. Belgium has a different medical legal culture than Canada, so we won't fall into those same problems. And we have. It started in Canada in 2016 with our first regime, which followed the Carter case and the Supreme Court of Canada, where they held that there had to be some room for physician-assisted dying for people with meeting certain conditions. The federal government passed a law in 2016, that was Bill C-14, and we started very much where you are now, in the sense that we were told it was for people who were having very difficult deaths. And the criterion that we had initially was for people with reasonably foreseeable natural deaths. And that criterion was challenged in the courts literally weeks after assisted dying was passed into law. The Lamb case in Vancouver, that case was ultimately dropped, and then the Truchon decision in Quebec, where one judge in the Quebec Superior Court held that it was unconstitutional to have reasonably foreseeable natural death as a limit on when people with disabilities could access MAID. So what the court said was that people with disabilities have to have access to MAID at any point in their lives that they may find their suffering intolerable, and that to put any limits on that would be paternalistic and discriminatory against people with disabilities. So then the government, instead of appealing that decision, which a government would do in almost any case where a national federal law had been struck down as unconstitutional, instead they expanded the law through Bill C-7 in 2021 in the midst of the pandemic, and extended medical assistance in dying to people whose deaths were not foreseeable. So we now have people with chronic pain, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, a number of conditions, frailty, which is basically anybody who's of a certain age. So we have all these conditions now leading to medical assistance in dying.
Isabel, this is so important though, because what you're saying is the law was passed and immediately people started challenging this. Was that activists who were challenging that through the court?
We have a very strong lobby group called Dying with Dignity, and they have been behind a lot of these challenges.
But it is Parliament. It's ultimately the Canadian government who has made law on this. So
the courts were the reason it started, but it's the Canadian government that it's the reason it has expanded and expanded. And we're now talking about you giving it to people who are no longer able to consent. So if someone made an advance request when they were capable of consent, we're talking about giving it to people with dementia, which will obviously disproportionately be older women with dementia.
It's fascinating to me. I don't think many people are aware of that challenge on the basis of disability. And it's interesting because the law that's being considered here explicitly excludes disability. So it says, to be clear, a person is not considered terminally ill and eligible on the basis of disability or mental illness alone. So I worry that same challenge, could be very easily made here.
Well, I would argue that anybody with a terminal illness has a disability, and I think anybody who can access MAID in Canada under the law has a disability. That's the nature of the definition of disability. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, for example, the definition is very broad and inclusive. So I think making a distinction between people who have terminal illness and disability is a bit of a misleading distinction.
Would one of you mind defining what track 1 and track 2 are?
Track 1 is when you have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, and there are fewer so-called safeguards in that context. You can get it the same day that you apply for it if, provider availability, assuming that the provider is available. Track 2 is where people have the same grievous and irremediable medical condition. So that's an illness, an incurable and serious illness, disease, or disability, and an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability and intolerable psychological or physical suffering. And so track 1 requires that you have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. Track 2 does not.
And track 1 essentially it's meant to mean terminal illness, although it's not explicitly the term that's used.
It's a version of an end of life, but it has been so stretched out of any realistic sense of end of life that it's increasingly not serving that purpose. That you can say, I'm going to stop eating if you don't give me MAID, and that can make you terminally ill.
Things in Canada, as Chelsea says, things in Canada are genuinely so bad, the headlines are so terrible over here from what happens with you that it is gauche to suggest that the UK would become like Canada. But, there are headlines people might have seen, like the Paralympian Christine Gauthier, who asked for a ramp to be put in her home and was instead offered to be assisted with death by somebody who worked for the government and who apparently had done this also, who'd recommended this also for other people as well.
When we think about, Christine Gauthier being offered MAID by some government worker, not a medical professional, but someone she's trying to consult about accessibility for her home, that the kind of breakdown of the line between suicide and medical assistance in dying keeps playing out over and over. That suicide prevention no longer seems to be a priority. And in fact, if we look at the guidelines by, the MAID assessors and providers, there's very much a view that because this is medical treatment, not suicide, that there's an ethical obligation to raise it with people who might be eligible and to actually present it to them as a treatment. And of course, if we understand this as suicide or as homicide, we'd never do that. We'd never think that there's an obligation to promote it or to lay it out as a kind of option. But when it's treated as medical treatment, then that norm shifts. And so we're seeing more and more of that. And if we move to a system of advanced directives that people can sign for when they're no longer competent, it will become part of just the sort of normal package of documents you sign. If you enter long-term care, you'll be asked if you want to sign an advanced directive so that they can kill you when you no longer have the capacity to make that decision.
And part of that treating it as medical treatment, as Janine was describing, is that if it's medical treatment, how can you deny medical treatment to anyone, right? Anyone who needs medical treatment or wants medical treatment should have access to it. So this framing of MAID as medical treatment has just led to a hugely expansive regime in Canada.
Yeah, and so relevant again here because our current proposed law says that doctors can raise it with patients. So it doesn't need to be asked for by the patient. It's something that can be offered to the patient. And there's a charity, domestic abuse charity, who's begin training people who work in cancer care to make them aware of domestic abusers who will, when somebody gets a diagnosis, who will quite often try and coerce a particular treatment on that, basically coerce that individual into a particular treatment. And obviously if death provided by the state is part of that menu of options of treatments, we could see abusers coercing the victims into state-provided death.
Well, the movement in Canada was very much built around a very famous case, the Latimer case, in which a father murdered his daughter, and his daughter had a very significant disability, Tracy Latimer. And the pro-death movement really did a great job of sort of propping him up as a national hero. He did go to jail, but ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada upheld his sentence for murder, but that was very much involved in the pro-death movement towards where we are now. So mercy killing and MAID there's a fine line between those two, so-called mercy killing.
Elizabeth, I think you've written about this case, haven't you? And then there's a follow-on, and this is one of the things we're also worried about, is that even where you have MAID or where you have assisted dying, people who are outside of that, it starts to affect them. And what seems to have happened in one case is, which I think is this chap called Francois Belzile, where he
killed his wife and he was charged. I believe they started with murder, but he ended up being convicted of manslaughter, not murder. And he got a compassionate sentence, I think, of 2 years.
House arrest. So no actual jail time.
No actual jail time. And he was seen as a sympathetic figure because he was portrayed as someone suffering from caregiver burnout. And I guess, I want to make a related point about coexisting types of disabilities, but it's a big concern that mercy killing is being both romanticized and minimized as a crime. And I mean, not just for abusive men, but for any men who may be in the position of taking care of wives. We know actually that overwhelmingly it's women who are in the caregiver position, not men. It's not expected of men. And I imagine some men may feel belittled by having to assume that role of caregiver of their spouse. And I think it's a really serious concern because, we have a society that diminishes the value of women, aging women, and particularly aging women with disabilities. So you have women's lives being devalued to begin with, and then this opportunity for these men to justify ending their caregiving responsibilities, essentially, by so-called acts of mercy killing. So I think it's a serious issue, and I think we only know the tip of the iceberg. Given that we have so little information and so little tracking of what's going on with MAID, we won't know about those men who pressured women to take MAID. There's just unless there's some family member who's aware of the relationship and the dynamics and what's happened or likely happened, we're never going to know. But the other thing I wanted to add when we were talking about trying to confine MAID to those people who are foreseeably facing imminent death, one of the issues is that our legislation certainly doesn't preclude someone who has an additional disability like mental illness from taking MAID. So although you can't currently get MAID solely on the basis of mental illness, you will be able to as of 2027. And so that was another expansion that I wanted to add to Isabel's discussion of the expansion of MAID. But even before 2027, even currently, and I think that was the case with the case of Donna, is that she had a physical disability that could be used to justify MAID, but she had a coexisting mental issue, right? She was suffering from brain injury and depression. And, there is no stop apart from basic capacity on those people who may be suffering from pretty serious mental ailments at the time they decide to take, medical assistance in death. So even if we say, well, you can't get it for mental illness, actually some people with mental illness are getting it. It's just that they are able to also rely on some sort of physical disability. And I think that's really important to notice because we also know that the mental illness category is going to predominantly be women and young girls.
One thing we've noticed in this law is that they say, oh, well, mental illness is excluded. As you've spoken to, mental illness is not excluded. A person cannot be granted assisted death solely on the basis of a mental illness. What if you were sitting with MPs in this moment? What advice might you give them to tighten, to ensure that people who are suicidal, depressed, or otherwise dealing with mental illness are not being granted lethal medications instead of suicide prevention?
Well, I think not to speak for all of us, but I think our position is that once you extend MAID beyond people for whom death is imminent, there just is no safeguard, right? There's just nothing, because there's this fundamental ableist principle that some people with disabilities are better off dead. And once you see killing them as a benefit to them, we just don't think any of the safeguards can stand up. One thing I'll just mention briefly about a there's a case in Vancouver now of a family suing for wrongful death after their loved one was given MAID on a day pass from a psychiatric hospital. And they are now challenging the law, saying that we don't allow it for mental illness, so it violates the charter rights of people to allow it for mental illness so long as you have diabetes or high blood pressure or arthritis, which is just a vast, proportion of the population. So they're bringing a constitutional challenge on that basis. So this law is being attacked from various directions, but there's just no safeguard. There's nothing. I mean, you can say doctors shouldn't be able to offer it, no one should be able to raise it. But how do you ever enforce that? Like you can't. The only way is to really have rigorous criteria for who can get it. And terminal illness is a pretty vague criteria. You can be terminally ill for a decade.
Yeah, and
I think it's important to recognize that people can be given a diagnosis that they're at stage 4 of a particular cancer diagnosis, and therefore, they are predicted to have 6 months to live or a year to live, and then live at stage 4 for many, many years. And so, these are all imprecise. It's interesting to me as well that in the very beginning of our discussion of assisted dying and euthanasia in Canada, there was actually some focus on people's ability to administer the lethal medication to themselves. And some of the earliest cases were people saying, well, I'm going to get to a point where because of my ALS, I won't be able to kill myself. And so I need a doctor to help me do it. And of course, that has completely gone out the window as well. I mean, in fact, in some provinces, it can't even be self-administered. It has to be a doctor. And, virtually no MAID deaths in Canada are self-administered. So even that very small, and I wouldn't call that a safeguard or something to put into law, but even that idea that in some jurisdictions we say, well, there should at least be that idea that if you are capable of administering this, you should have to overcome that impulse to live and administer it to yourself, we've taken away. And I think for mental illness, that's a particularly significant distinction, because suicidality is often a fleeting, state of mind. It comes and goes. But if somebody else is teed up to commit suicide for you, it's much harder to change your mind and to resist, and to not go through with a death that's been staged and planned with all of your, supporters there, the Dying with Dignity people or whoever it is that are going to accompany you to this procedure.
There's litigation going on in Ontario of a constitutional challenge to the law. One of the applicants went to a psychiatric facility because she was feeling suicidal and she'd had past suicide attempts. And she said, the doctors told me to come when I was feeling suicidal so that I could be safe. And instead of that, she was offered MAID. And the provider the person told her that it would be much more peaceful and calm than her last suicide attempt, right? Which speaks to what Janine was saying in that, we portray this as peaceful and calm and painless, and you just drift off to sleep. But this woman had someone and said, the psychiatric system's in turmoil. We can't offer you a bed, but have you thought about MAID? And let me tell you how MAID happens. It's really peaceful. We'll give you these drugs to relax you and calm you down. And that did her enormous harm. And she talks about that in her affidavit before the court, that's really damaging to portray suicide as this kind of peaceful, calm, just go to sleep and your pain will disappear.
These are just abominable outcomes. I mean, just back to Janine's point on that there was this thought that you could introduce friction perhaps by the person having to administer the medicine themselves, so that it wasn't a medical procedure. There was a little bit of a safeguard there. That, I think, is the proposal here in the UK, that people will if they cannot fully administer the medication themselves, and presumably lots of people who are terminally ill will need support to do that. A doctor will kind of hold the medication to your lips, perhaps. From what you're saying, it sounds like that safeguard will quickly slip away.
Well, the trial judge in Carter actually put that as a condition on her order, that before Gloria Taylor, who was the applicant in that case, before she had to, unless she was unable to swallow the meds herself, it had to be self-administered. By the time it got to the Supreme Court of Canada, that was gone.
Wow.
And MAID providers claim that there's less certainty of self, ingestion of the pills as opposed to a needle straight to the vein. So less suffering, they argue, and more certainty of death. So they have reasons that they give for why they are doing IV injections as opposed to allowing people to take medications themselves. So I would be very surprised if it didn't switch very quickly in the UK.
Yeah, it's cruel. It's cruel to make someone take pills themselves. It takes longer. They will suffer longer.
Suffer longer. It might not work.
One concern that I heard in the parliamentary debate on the bill, which has not yet been passed, so there's still opportunity, is real concerns around coercion, which you've all mentioned. Can you speak to how difficult it would be to create a safeguard that would truly prevent coercion? And perhaps there's data from Canada that could be illuminating.
Well, there's no data because we don't collect that data. But I mean, one of the things in Canada is that we have doctors who have become specialists at MAID provision. In other words, that's what they do. They end people's lives. And you don't know the person whose life you were ending, right? You do the MAID assessment, you maybe spend a couple of hours with them at most. And that's the end. That's your entire relationship with them. You may have had their family doctor say, no, I'm worried about this person. They may have been a victim of violence or, other forms of coercion. I will not consider MAID. And then they just go to one of these providers and get it. So the idea that people are going to be fully disclosing all of the complexities of the coercion they are experiencing from an intimate partner or other family member or loved one is just completely unrealistic.
It can take many forms, right? There is this sort of direct coercion that we might see in a violent or coercively controlling relationship, but there's also that implicit pressure that, Mom, you're draining our inheritance, and this has become a burden, and I'm having to leave my job to come and look after you. And we know how gendered those kinds of reactions are and who is more likely to be impacted by them and to say, well, I've now become an obstacle to my family's financial future or happiness or what have you, and I'm going to take myself out of the picture. And so coercion doesn't always have to be overt for it to be there, particularly in a system that's not well funded to support older adults who are predominantly women.
I think there's such an important point you made, Janine and Elizabeth, but at the moment there is no data collection on this that would show the kind of thing that we fear in domestic abuse or coercion of vulnerable people. There's no data collection by the state, but there's also, if I understand, you don't have any kind of safeguarding that says identify if this person is being coerced. Like there isn't a tick list that says
there's a requirement for that it be a voluntary decision. But I mean, yeah, that's it.
It's interesting because they're depending on a physician or two physicians in the law here to assess for coercion. And that's not something you typically ask a physician to do. It's a really strange safeguard. This may be different in Canada, but in the UK, we have an overstretched healthcare system. So asking a physician to assess whether there's been internal, systemic, relational coercion that is affecting this decision in a short period of time, I worry that it's a fantasy of a safeguard rather than one that will legitimately protect people.
Yeah. In Australia, they ask medical professionals in a couple of the states to check for domestic abuse as part of this voluntary tick list, and they've never screened anyone out ever, despite perhaps 15% of people in Australia suffering domestic abuse as elderly people. They find no one and screen out no one. And so, as you say, there's an issue with inventing safeguards because the perception here in the UK will never be like Canada. Canada is wild. But actually, Canada has lots of governance and safeguards and paperwork and hearings.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that.
Okay, go on.
There are not lots of safeguards in Canada. Well, most of them have fallen away as they've been reconstrued as barriers to access and not safeguards.
And really, we only find out after the person's dead. Like there's no screening that allows for any intervention along the way. It's only when family members or friends have found out that they have tried to leap in and try to stop it. So there is nothing that would slow it down on our end. I mean, even the waiting period can be waived in the discretion of assessors. So,
and there used to be a waiting period for track 1. It's gone, right? That just disappeared. And Donna Duncan's daughters, years after their mother's death, they are still trying to get access to her MAID approval. You know, like they have been fighting this and just finding barriers at every single step.
This is what's so odd about it, is that it is the assisted dying regimes everywhere seem to be about what we would call secrecy, what they might call privacy. And as I think Janine's said in one of your papers, feminists know to be wary of secrets when the result is a death of a woman. This is not like a normal medical treatment where you've rolled out a new medical treatment and it starts killing the wrong people and you pause it. You would pause it. There'll be an investigation. But it seems to be unstoppable.
Well, and especially because, you know, typically suicide is an exception to rules around medical privacy. We actually make exceptions. We make exceptions for doctors and for lawyers when someone is suicidal to breach confidentiality in order to save a life. But with MAID, we've turned that on its head and repackaged it as medical treatment. And then all of a sudden, privacy is in the ascendancy and family members are being told you're interfering in your family members' medical treatment. And we've certainly seen in Canada, those campaigning in favor of MAID demonizing opponents by saying you're just like the anti-abortionists and you want to stop women from accessing things, just like those men who were trying to prevent their partners from getting abortions, with no recognition that, death is something quite different.
Big campaigning organisation, Dignity in Dying, it's called here in the UK, says "My body, my choice" as part of their slogans, that women's voices must not be silenced in access to choice on death and abortion. And the abortion campaign in Ireland, just over the water here, was very successfully based on it being unacceptable that a single woman might die as a result of the old law. Whereas this is the opposite. This is you get this wrong, you're killing women. And I find the commingling of those two campaigns just bizarre. I mean, we think that assisted dying is a huge issue for women. It's a huge feminist issue. I mean, do you agree? And I suppose what's been the feminist response in Canada to this?
Well, we certainly agree that it's a feminist issue. We agree that it's a feminist issue not only because, counting the bodies, we are certainly seeing, far more women than men taking track 2 MAID. I think our rate is about 60% women under track 2. And if we include mental illness, it will be much higher. We'll be in the 70% or something, women. But not just because we're counting the bodies, but also, in terms of the reasons why women might seek it, why doctors might suggest it to women patients, and why the government seems able to carry on with this policy without ever stopping and itself counting the bodies. What will be the impact on women? They've decided to go ahead, come what may. So we have very clear indications that this is a women's issue and a feminist issue. In Canada, however, there's only 2 women's organizations that have raised their heads. That's the Disabled Women's Network, DAWN, and the Feminist Alliance for International Action, FAFIA. Other than that, all the women's organizations have been silent. And so there is really no widespread feminist support.
And I would argue that a reflection of the way that this kind of notion of a very sort of thin choice feminism has really taken root in some of these feminist organizations. And so they don't go beyond a very sort of basic civil libertarian analysis, not a feminist analysis, that a choice is somehow something to be validated, even if it results in a dead woman. So there's an argument to be made that the hollowing out of some of Canadian feminism is not disconnected from the silence of Canadian women's organizations on this issue.
Just back to Elizabeth's point on mercy killings, where you've seen there where men are committing homicides and being given sympathy. Because we have so much in common, our nations, we have a big issue with this. So this has been the case for many decades. And actually it's been part of the assisted dying campaign for 50 years or so, has been to push for these men to be released from prison, to not be sent to jail, because they are viewed as sympathetic cases, despite being violent homicides of vulnerable, disabled women very often. I really worry about giving a secretive, defensive, lawful state process provided by medical providers all over the nation who will see anyone who don't need to have a prior relationship and who can even suggest this to you. Can you even safeguard? Can you even slow this down, I wonder?
Well, we're trying, right? I mean, there is this constitutional litigation in Ontario that is trying to get rid of Track 2, arguing that it's discriminatory against people with disabilities. So.
And
Track, just in case
government, we may be able to, to convince, we'll have an election soon in Canada, a new government to, not go ahead with the extension to mental illness and maybe to, we hope, get rid of Track 2 altogether. But the more that these processes become normalized and ingrained as the responsible way to die, the harder it is to expose the abuses and shift that discourse.
I think you're just so wonderful. I know you from previous campaigning work, but I worry that the resistance to this in Canada is down to individual families, bereaved families often, speaking out, to fantastic academics like you supporting and doing legal challenges. I mean, are you hugely well funded in doing this work?
No. I mean, I will say the Constitutional Challenge, ironically enough, got a small sum of money from a federal government program set up to fund constitutional challenges to its own legislation. It's pro bono lawyers who believe in what they're doing. It's volunteers like us who think it's important. So there's no funding. And organizations like Dying with Dignity have enormous fundraising. If you look at the list of corporations that donate money to Dying with Dignity, it's quite shocking.
Can you speak to, do you have any sense of what the financial incentive is behind it? And also, you mentioned companies. What is pushing this agenda forward internationally right now?
Well,
I mean, go ahead, Liz.
Kind of a sideways comment, but I did want to say that the dismantling and tattering of our social welfare system, our healthcare system, our social welfare system, our housing, I mean, those are happening in England as well as in Canada. And we see no end in sight to the dismantling of all of those systems, which will certainly create a greater demand for MAID, because women are homeless, women are without access to the medical care they need. At the same time, governments for sure find I think the federal government had actually issued some numbers. It's way cheaper to kill people than to provide them with what they need. Way, way, way cheaper. And so, I mean, from the government's perspective, there's just no doubt about what their incentive is. No doubt at all. Organizations like Dying with Dignity, I have less of an insight into what motivates them to pursue this campaign so relentlessly and really with no outward stopping that we can foresee in the future. Because as Janine said the other day, the minute we have advanced consent, then they will be asking for substituted consent. So we know, there is no outer limit to this. It's an ever-expanding campaign. I don't know, Isabel or Janine, do you have insights into why Dying with Dignity is so committed to this?
I actually looked at their list of funders, and it's a little bizarre. There are airport authorities donating to Dying with Dignity, TELUS and Rogers, who are two national phone carriers. There were American corporations that actually was raised in the U.S. Senate that, that there were American donors. I don't understand it. I mean, I think at some level, everybody fears death, and that there's this myth that MAID has allowed us to master death and to control it and to make it peaceful and warm and fuzzy for everyone. But I don't know how that operates at a corporate level. So, I mean, there are more cynical possibilities. Drug companies are going to have to provide these drugs that are used for MAID that have never been tested for the purpose of killing people. You know, we're allowing doctors to kind of make up drug regimes. We don't prescribe a drug regime. There are all kinds of financial incentives involved for different actors. So it's hard to understand. You know, there are feminists or self-identified feminist law professors like us actively fighting on the other side of this. So, yeah.
Isabel, we've mentioned this before, but it's a very female-fronted campaign here in the UK, and I find that interesting because I know there are lots of men in these organisations, but from the way they fronted it, it's all about women.
Yeah, and that's been true in Canada too. Most, other than Jean Touchon, most of the plaintiffs in these cases have been women. The lawyers have been women, other than, you know, a couple of notable people. So yeah, it is. I mean, I guess one question that I just wanted to raise briefly, one point, is that what's left of suicide prevention efforts once you allow physicians to end people's lives? I mean, that's something we've really seen in Canada, people phoning suicide crisis lines and being talked to about MAID. That I don't know where we go with suicide prevention. At the same time, they were rolling out MAID hotlines where you could phone and get information about MAID. The government rolled out a suicide prevention hotline where you could phone and get information, get help when you were in crisis. But then people on those lines are talking to people about MAID. So it really does. It just feels like an absolute nightmare in Canada and very difficult to stop. Once you start it, you cannot roll it back. And the only way it's going to move is towards expansion. So we are all watching the UK with such hope that maybe you won't take the path that Canada took. But once you do, it feels like it's almost, there's an inevitability. It will push forward. How could you be cruel and deny people this comfort?
Well, and then we start making decisions about who should be calling the suicide prevention hotline and who should be calling the MAID hotline, whose life is worth living and whose life is not. And we need to confront that because, yes, it's been women at the front of some of these pro-MAID campaigns, but it's also wealthy women, white women, you know, women with resources who want that final act of control to plan their romantic final ending to their lives. And so I think we do have to recognize the privilege that's been behind some of this as well. And it's not been to the benefit of people with disabilities.
And if I can just mention that, you know, the constitutional challenge that's being brought in Ontario, those two individuals involved in that case are not wealthy, privileged women. One of them is a trans person and one of them is a woman, but they are both on social assistance. They are both struggling and trying very hard to live. One of the things we haven't had time to talk about is not just the harm that does to women who may die prematurely, but the harm this does to women who are trying to live with disabilities and not getting the support that they need. One of the plaintiffs in this case talks about MAID being a monkey on their back. It's this thing that's hanging over them in every decision they make. Every day they have to wake up and decide, should I live or am I a burden on everybody? And should I let the government end my life?
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this and so grateful for you listening too. Thank you.